Hi, I'm Dr. David Feifel. I'm a psychiatrist, neuroscientist, and psychedelic medicine pioneer, and you're listening to Professionally Psychedelics.
Where do they go, the smoke rings I blow each night? Oh, what
Is
do they
there an
do,
incentive
those
for
girls?
insurance companies to band together and see ketamine rated for depression? Because I see your argument from the pharmaceutical side, and unless you're Johnson and Johnson creating your patented Spravato or what have you, there is
Right.
no commercial benefit to getting ketamine on the approved list for depression treatment. But surely, as an insurer, when you're paying out the rear for all these SSRIs or other expensive antidepressive treatments, surely a breakthrough like ketamine would be pretty cost effective. So if they would invest that lump sum in getting it accepted, they could reduce their costs on the tail end of depression treatment over the next while. Or is it a game of chicken where they're waiting for someone else to do that?
Well, I think you're right. The incentives of the insurance companies are different than the pharmaceutical companies. They welcome more effective treatments because it can, especially with a chronic disease that carries a large cost associated with it. If there's something effective, by all logic, they should be seeking this. So there is a lot of hope that despite the big disadvantage of not having FDA approval, it's possible that insurance companies, either on their own or through some consortium, might get together and review the existing evidence. There's even some talk of some actually sponsoring their own studies and getting it approved. So we do have hope that that's going to change because the drug is so compelling, and so I think we can. And there are precedents. There are precedences for drugs that or treatments that never got FDA approval for one reason or another that did get accepted as what the term is, medical necessity drug. That there are situations where this drug is the right choice. We recognize that for treating a person, and we will cover it. So I'm hopeful that that's going to happen. Actually, Spravato, I think, might actually be a catalyst for that because what is Spravato? Spravato was a way of different pharmaceutical companies. On the one hand, didn't recognize that it made no sense to get ketamine itself approved, but they also recognize that there's a tremendous opportunity here for somehow being able to take advantage of this breakthrough treatment. So some companies decide to try and develop what we call new chemical entities, completely novel molecules that did what ketamine would do, would go in there and would essentially produce the same kind of brain effects, but because they're a different molecule, you get a patent on it. So there's been several drugs that have been developed, and there's some interesting stories attached to how they turned out. Johnson Johnson, I think, tried to take a safer approach. They said, well, look, we know ketamine works, and we know that there's ways of tweaking a molecule that make it novel, that make it outside the previous patent possibly, but are close enough that they're likely to still have the effects of ketamine. So what they did is they advanced S-ketamine.
Is that the nasal spray?
Well, that's the second thing. So they took S-ketamine and they developed it as a spray to treat depression. So when you've got rather than ketamine as an intravenous infusion, or as we do it here at Kadima, an intramuscular shot, a lot. Their novel, approach was S-ketamine, a little bit of a different molecule, and as a nasal administration. That was enough to get a patent. Actually, there was a patent that had already been submitted and granted by the patent office, so they just licensed that, and then they developed it and got it approved by the FDA, and so they have a patent that can protect any company from infringing on it with a generic. The FDA might tell them that they're fine with it, but as soon as they do, they get slapped with a lawsuit that, hey, you're infringing on our patent, our being Johnson and Johnson. So insurance companies know, okay, well, here's an FDA approved drug, and they're starting to cover it. Now the irony is, it turns out it's recognized that it's less effective than ketamine because nasal administration produces much lower blood levels. You hardly get the sort of psychedelic level kinds of brain levels with Spravato.
Is that not just a dosing question then, or is there something
Well, it
fundamentally
might
different?
be. It might be, except that we don't have the ability to compensate for that by giving higher doses because the drug comes in a metered nasal spray, and that's what it is. You can't say with regular ketamine we customize the dose to each patient because every patient has different sort of sensitivity.
That reminds me of Jonathan's question a while back. What makes a patient a good patient for ketamine?
Right. There we go. See, all things come around eventually. So I'll take it from a symptom point of view. We see, and that's I know how I got off on it because I was saying, well, he was asking about all the psychedelics. I said, well, like we can speak with much more certitude about ketamine because we just have more experience with it because we can, all the other drugs we're doing it through research protocols because they are Schedule 1, and therefore there's no legal mechanism to treat a patient with those drugs because they're not recognized as medicines that you can prescribe. But you can't. But if there's a research protocol, you can. So I have a Schedule 1 license from the DEA allowing me to do research with those drugs, but I cannot prescribe those drugs. It has to be a patient who signs informed consent for an approved protocol. When we talk about ketamine and what sort of the optimal patients, I think I would start with suicidal people who have significant suicidal ideation. They're racked by thoughts of not wanting to be alive, temptations to end their life. We see that ketamine has a very profound effect on that symptom or that phenomenon. The next, going down the line, I would say, is depression as a whole. The sort of the anhedonia, the lack of interest or pleasure in things. So the suicidal ideation usually is embedded as part of the depression in people whose depression gets so extreme they start to develop suicidal ideation. So they're usually it's usually a patient. Both those things usually come from major depression, but you can have major depression without suicidal ideation. But you rarely have suicidal ideation without depression, unless it's unless you're in some cult where the idea of killing yourself is to meet up with the mothership or
Jonestown.
Exactly. But the suffering suicidal ideation, like I don't want to be here anymore. This is too painful. Comes from primarily an outgrowth of a severe depression. But we find that the suicidal ideation is very effectively improved with ketamine. So after suicidal ideation and depression, I would next say OCD. It can be greatly improved with ketamine treatments, and PTSD along probably at the same level in the hierarchy. And anxiety I would put up there with the depression because they often do go hand in hand. Sometimes patients who have depression, will manifest more anxiety than depression, and 6 months later it could flip. So, what we've got there is suicidal thinking, depression, anxiety, OCD, PTSD are the ones that we see the most consistent benefits. There's good evidence for things like social anxiety, which is kind of a version of anxiety, but a kind of more specific aspect of it. Eating disorders, we've seen some remarkable things. It's very exciting. These things, they change people's feeling about things. People feel. I have so many sound bites in my brain from having seen thousands of patients. I've treated thousands of ketamine treatments and debriefing people after that and integrating trying to integrate what they've experienced. So the patient who was so suicidal, tried committing suicide several times, and actually writing, because we have a tool that we give patients, a survey or like a, I don't know if it's a survey or questionnaire, but part of it, what it is they write out what they've experienced, and it helps consolidate. There is evidence that if you write something out, it helps consolidate that in your brain. So when you study something, instead of just reading the textbook, you rewrite it. You're more likely to remember it, and that's one of the big challenges. That you have this profound, life-changing experience during the trip, if you will, and you feel very different when you come out, and it's an incredible lesson and truths that you've just been shown. But there's a proclivity as you get out into the mundane day-to-day world that tends to dissipate, and you tend to forget those important pearls of insight. Getting back to that patient who was so suicidal, couldn't see why they would want to stay in this world, wrote, "Life is so precious. Why would anyone want to throw it away?" Right? I mean, that's a difference between 1 hour.
It's total 180.
Total 180. I mean, people just see what they could not see before, what was all around them, and they couldn't see it before. And when I say see it, I mean like feel it. Suddenly they do. And then there's all kinds of comments about gratitude. I'm so grateful for my spouse, my kids, my whatever it is. There's just that's something that was sort of taken for granted and sort of behind the blinds. They didn't have access to that feeling. Suddenly it's like, wow, life is so amazing, and I'm part of this incredible reality and world and universe and nature, and I'm this entity in it and connected to everything. And and some people will just write love, on their in big letters on their we call it the PES, the psychedelic experience survey. So it's meant to be kind of short enough that people will be willing to do it after the and capable of doing it after the treatment, but enough to give us information about how intense it was and how positive the emotional feeling was, and all the different aspects, the insight, the sort of visual feature, hallucinatory features, the dissociation, so that we can we can adjust, for example, the dose as they might be coming back and so forth. So that's a tool that we use. But the most fun and fascinating part has been the open narrative part, where people write, and they'll just sometimes just write love. Love is what it's all about. And these are people that you wouldn't expect. Sometimes, knowing them, you wouldn't expect that would be something that they would write on a document. So it's really fascinating. For the first time, one of the things about ketamine is, for the first time in psychiatry that I know of, we have a drug that has the potential to really alter the clinical situation immediately. Occasionally I have a patient whose safety I am so worried about that I contemplate, hospitalizing them. It's something I rarely do, because I feel that, it's often not overall beneficial. That can do sometimes more harm than benefit. So it's not something I go to very frequently at all. But I now have the option of offering a ketamine treatment, and I can't tell you how many times we've aborted the possible need for hospitalization, within 2 hours by giving this drug. So psychiatry's never had anything that's like, it's a good chance I can make you feel better right now. That's not psychiatry. It's usually, well, here's this medication. If you take it every day, and several weeks down the road, you may start to feel better. You probably will feel the side effects after the first treatment. So that's just so you know, that'll come on right away. But the good stuff, that takes a while. So that's a game changer. The ability to have something that's sort of like, break the glass. We need to do something right now.
Crisis intervention, I guess.
Crisis intervention, yes. I'll tell you a really interesting anecdote to characterize this. I had a patient who actually was a veteran, female, and she was we've had a lot of patients referred to us from the Veterans Administration Hospital here in San Diego, because a lot of the psychiatrists there know about the work that I do and what we do in Kadima, especially from back when I was at UCSD several years ago, and the VA is next door, and so there's a lot of cross pollination, if you will, between the psychiatrists at UCSD and the VA. And so they would send me a lot of very, very ill veterans with PTSD and depression and suicidal ideation. I had one lady who was a high-ranking officer, actually, who I had treated at UCSD years ago with another very exciting advance in psychiatry called transcranial magnetic stimulation. It's a treatment that stimulates parts of the brain that's involved in depression to treat it. And she had a wonderful effect. And I always tell everybody that when they get a good effect, if they start to feel that the depression is returning, which depression tends to be a relapsing, recurring condition for most people, that she come in don't wait, come in quickly. And a couple years later, she called me up and said, I've been a bad patient because I remember you telling me to come in quickly, but I didn't, and I'm in really bad shape. And I said to her, what about a ketamine treatment? And she, what's ketamine? I sat down with her, I talked to her about it. I let her look at the consent form, and I said, look, I can't guarantee anything because we always start at a lower dose. You've never had it. It might be too low because we usually look at it as a process. You come in, you're an unknown, so we get a low dose, and we see how sensitive you are, and then we adjust the dose the next time you come in, so on and so forth. But so we went ahead and gave her the treatment. As I think I mentioned, we tend to give it as an intramuscular injection because our patients prefer that over the infusion, and for setting reasons, which I can go into. And it was amazing. And I was like, I wonder if this will work, because I could tell she was really in a very, very bad place. And I walked in and we talked afterwards, and she just was speechless. Like, that was like, I've never experienced anything like that. She said, as I was feeling it hit me and I was floating and kind of feeling if I was going out of my body, I heard, this is a high-ranking person who's in the intelligence division of the armed forces. I heard the universe whisper to me that it's going to be okay. And she said, and then what happened was I saw my husband. And part of what was happening with her is that she was going through a divorce with her husband. And I won't get into the details, but she felt betrayed. She had actually signed up for an additional tour, and had developed the PTSD during that extra tour, in part for for their financial future. And then when she came back, he had kind of announced that he was leaving. So she was very bitter, and she was very stressed out that they were going to have a meeting coming up where it was going to be with the attorneys, and she just couldn't deal with that. And she was very anxious about that, and very mad and angry. And she said that his image came to me, and instead of the anger, I just felt gratitude and said, look, we had X number of years together, and we've had kids, and you needed to move on. And she says, I couldn't believe I was thinking those thoughts, because the thoughts I normally have about that are very different about him. And it was like she couldn't believe it herself. She was like, and I just look at it a different way. It's just like, it's not a big deal in the big picture of things. We all move on. We're all just here as part of the journey. And so that gives you kind of a little taste of sort of what happens in people's mind, the shifting of their of the way they view things. It's a frame shift that we've just never seen before with other treatments.
And that's in common with psilocybin as well, because I wanted to go on to the topic before we ran out of time of your work with compass pathways and psilocybin in particular. So the outcome at least seems to be, oh yes, this is very interesting in treatment-resistant depression. So from a sort of view from not a medical professional, it looks like it's treating a similar problem with a similar mechanism.
So we can look at it at all the levels that I had mentioned before. So if we look at the cellular level, in terms of what it actually does in the brain, it's different. It binds to a different receptor. It binds to something called the serotonin 1A, and on the 1A, instead of taking the parking lot and wasting the parking lot, it actually acts like serotonin. So it's parking, but it's going in and doing a very robust business. It's adding to the natural activity that receptor would have, rather than sort of blocking the activity. So if you look at it at that level, they're very different. However, if you start moving up to the next level in terms of what's happening to the brain, when we take a picture of the brain and the activity, it's very similar. So we see that default mode network shuts down, and there's that global, increased activity where you're going through all those side streets, and the motorways are shut down. And then the next level is the sort of the subjective phenomenological level of experience, and that's also very similar. It's very similar to there are some differences. Ketamine tends to have more of the out-of-body experience, and psilocybin. So there are some differences, but on the whole, they're very similar. In fact, they've done studies where people have had ketamine and they've had psilocybin, and then after each treatment, they've filled out a very comprehensive survey, much more research-y than the one that we do in the clinic, because in research, that's part of what you're promising to do, is give up a lot of information. So they fill out what's called the 5D ASC, altered state of consciousness survey, and it asks all kinds of things about what you experienced in terms of the insight and the visual stuff, and the melting of your boundaries and merging into the universe, and the oceanic boundlessness was one. And it turns out that there's a lot of overlap. If you look at the ratings for ketamine and psilocybin, they greatly overlap. So you're definitely seeing something. Interestingly enough, the MDMA ratings are sort of an outlier from LSD and psilocybin and ketamine, which tend to be more similar. And the MDMA has been referred to as an empathogen more. It tends to focus more on that kind of loving everybody kind of thing, as opposed to the profound, deep insights. Like, my patients sometimes feel they understand the physics of the entire universe at the quantum level. They can see it happening. And that doesn't happen as much, I think, with MDMA. I think it's more just feeling connected and feeling love. So again, it depends on what level we're talking about. So at the global brain level, and it's certainly at the subject phenomenological level, psilocybin and ketamine are very similar. And I've had patients who've done both, and they'll say, I kind of like, the one per se, they're both, but I kind of like the psilocybin better because of A, B, and C. And some will say, actually, I thought really the ketamine was more remarkable. So there's that natural individual variation, but on the whole, aside from their most reductionist functions, there's definitely, now the duration is very different, right? Because psilocybin being taken orally gets absorbed, and the experience is prolonged several hours. With ketamine, if you're giving an infusion, it's as long as you want to do the infusion, but typically the treatments are an hour or less if it's an infusion. Our average duration of treatment is we've actually measured it. It's like 80 between 80 to 90 minutes on average.
I guess a question that I have for you, David, is once the necessary continued research and regulatory changes have come into place, would there be an argument to say that at that point talk therapies are dead, or will there always be a place for talk therapies? Maybe it's a sort of glib way to look at it, but perhaps sort of using a Roald Dahl analogy, it almost sounds like talk therapies and traditional treatments are the conventional chocolate bar, and these psychedelic compounds are the golden ticket. Where do you think we're actually sitting on this?
Well, I think that if anything is likely to be at risk, it's the conventional medications. I think they will really suffer in comparison to the profound effects of this new generation of treatments. And then there again, there's that whole thing that I just alluded to, the neuromodulation, the ability to go in and create changes in the brain, non-invasively, non-pharmacologically, by things like electromagnetic fields and things like that, which actually possibly could be, you could replicate psychedelic experiences in a much more controlled way that way, if you think about the possibilities. So I think honestly the traditional medications that came out in the late 50s and are still reign supreme so far to this point are likely to have very little role once we have this whole new generation of medications and the spectrum of compounds that are in the pipeline. Talk therapy, I think, is a different thing. One could argue, to take the devil's advocate position to what you just said, Jonathan, that talk therapy may actually fulfill its full potential. One of the limitations, I think, of talk therapy has been that when your nervous system is shut down with depression, it's hard to process. I mean, people so you're asking people to do some heavy cognitive work, and they can, they find it hard to shower, let alone, so they're so shut down. A lot of times what ends up happening is when we treat them, and this is true even with the conventional medication, if somebody has a really good effect to it and suddenly their nervous system sort of gets sparked up, and they're not, we have a term, psychobiological term in the field called neurovegetation, when you're in a vegetative state, like almost like the neurological condition, which is sort of just one step above a coma, but it's due to depression. You're just so shut down, you're flat. When you're in that state, which is not uncommon with severe depression, doing talk therapy, which is an active process. We have to listen and integrate it into it and make it part of your, it's like code. It's like code. The therapist is giving you code and wants to, and you need to kind of like insert it into your code. That takes work. So we often see, I'll get therapists call me up and say, I don't know what you're doing over there, but I can tell you that we've made more progress in the last 2 months, with patient X than the last 2 years. Mm. Then you add the ability, then you add to that the incredible lubrication, if you will, of psychological content, personal content that comes out during the treatments. And I think you've got a whole lot of now opportunity for psychotherapy. So that would be an argument saying, well, on the contrary, dead. Now we have sort of a biological tool that actually is going to turbo boost the potential for psychotherapy, going hand in hand. I'm not saying that that's going to be the case, but I think it's more likely that the result will be towards that end than psychotherapy being dead. However, I do think there's something interesting in the fact that the psychedelic drugs, we see it with ketamine, tend to produce a kind of auto psychotherapy. I had one patient, a young lady who, again, going back to all these sound bites, she said, "Wow, ketamine is kind of like it reminds me of the therapy that I've done, but I'm getting the therapy, but I'm also the therapist."
Full service medicine.
Absolutely. We don't have to pay, a therapy fee to an outside provider, so yeah, we do see a lot of it. People just feel that, and people will say, "Oh, I got to come back. I feel like I'm really close to. I'm working something through, and I feel I'm really close, and I just need another." So there's a sense that you're making progress. You're doing, and that is especially true with PTSD, where you're not talking about, let's say, an inherent biological or genetic condition that was there. It's just there. It's like it's like patient. I say, I'm ashamed in a way because I have a perfect life. I have a great family. I have a loving partner, and financially, we're in a great place. But I wake up every morning and I just disappointed that I'm here again. With PTSD, there had to be some sort of event, and that event it looms so large in their psyche, and yet they cannot really process it because there's sort of like an electrified fence around it. Whenever anything sort of gets them to remind them of it, their alarm, their physiological alarms go off, so they avoid it, right? That's the nature of PTSD. There's something that is so traumatic, but it was also so fear-inducing that they don't want to, they can't go there. And when anything in the environment kind of forces them to go there, it's horrible and they want to flee, right? But in the psychedelic experiences, the fear of harm is taken away often, so they can actually sit with the trauma and feel and not feel that they're re-experiencing it, so they can make progress. I've had patients who say, I watched it. I think of a patient who had sexual assault, and she said, I actually sat there and watched it, and I felt like I was sitting on God's lap and safe and secure. And he said, nothing can happen to you. Let's watch what happened. And they come away just feeling they have, in some ways, kind of advanced. They've taken some of the power away. And I've had patients who say, I'm done with it. I watched it. I can tell you that I had a female patient said, I walked all around it and I saw it from every angle. And I just forgave the perp, quote unquote. And it's like my jaw just dropped. And it's like, it's like, I'm not going to forget that ever happened, but it's not going to be this, this thing that's holding me back in my life anymore. Isn't that incredible?
It's a huge breakthrough.
Do you think physicians should, in training for this, as some psychedelic assisted therapies advocate, should undergo psychedelic treatment themselves, sort of how counselors are counseled before they become counselors?
Oh, brilliant question. You took mine.
That's a great question. That's a great question. And that is such a controversial question. My feeling in general is, for decades, when the psychedelics were sort of offline in terms of the mainstream sort of medicine and research, it went underground, in the 70s with the Controlled Substance Act and the Nixon administration. So they continued in a sort of subculture, and if you will, religious kinds of dogmas. One of which is, in order to be a provider, of psychedelic treatments, you have to experience that. Personally, I feel we have to ask those questions that both of you wanted to, that both of you kind of it was on both of your minds. We have to ask that question openly. There's some people who say, no, that's an absolute, and I say, why? Like, what's the evidence? Because there's so many things that are handed down as dogma that when we submit them to objective investigation, we find out, it turns out it's not true. For example, when the first studies came out of ketamine producing these just dramatic, remarkable improvements in depression, I know providers who had been using ketamine over the decades as a tool for their psychotherapy, as a lubricant for their psychotherapy. But for them, it was always the psychotherapy, and the ketamine as a drug couldn't couldn't be therapeutic in itself. So they had a hard time. They were aghast at the idea that you can, like these studies were done at academic centers by biological psychiatrists who put people, on a gurney and put a needle in them and infused ketamine, and people's depressions were being vaporized at least temporarily, and they just couldn't accept it, and they said that's not true, and then it kind of like more and more studies came out, said, okay, well, that can happen, but it's not as optimal or durable or deep as when it's done in conjunction with psychotherapy. But that was a big step for them to say, hey, I have to admit that you can just give this medication without any of the, the psychological therapies and get profound therapeutic effects. That was a big leap that they had to accept because the evidence kept, study after study replicated that. And so they retreated to a different line of defense. Well, yes, you can do that, but, and I don't know. They may be right. That line of defense may be that, that's, But my point is that question has to be asked. And there's some people who say like it's a done deal. I personally don't see any reason why a provider has to have. And I asked the question, why you don't an oncologist, you wouldn't expect them to have to go through feeling what chemotherapy is. One has to ask why, and when you ask why is it important that the provider, they come up with reasons that don't really, I haven't found anything compelling. So I'm not saying yes or no, but it doesn't seem like I've heard anything compelling. So I'll give you an example. One response I had was, well, if you were climbing the a mountain in the Himalayas, wouldn't you want your Sherpa to have been up that mountain? Sounds very compelling, but then I thought about it, and I thought about my experience with my patients and with ketamine, and I say, well, that analogy doesn't hold because there is no one mountain, and that Sherpa goes up a different mountain than I will be going up a mountain. And if that Sherpa is sure that the path is to the left around this next corner, because that's always where it is in his mountain, he could lead me astray. Every time a person goes up the mountain, it is a bit different for them even. So even that, so there is no mountain. Everest is not Everest. It's your Everest and my Everest, and my Everest during today's treatment is not exactly the same as it was during yesterday's treatment. And if you're so sure that you're leading me on an Everest that's one you're familiar with, it may be counterproductive. So again, this is why I think there's a lot of things that are being inherited now that psychedelics are coming into medicine. There's people who want to say, well, this is how it's done, and you have to do. I mean, there were people who told me it won't work inside a building. It has to be out in nature. Well, that's not true. I actually think that if we apply an open, we don't want to totally fit this new type of treatment back into the old paradigm, but we want to take the agnostic posture of Western medicine that asks the questions, that ask, is the emperor wearing clothes or not? And we still want that, because that's been incredibly valuable. That's what's made Western medicine, I think, very powerful. So we want to apply that. We want to ask all the questions. You talk about the subjective experience being important, but what part of this is it all? Or there's certain aspects that carry most of the therapeutic effect. We're doing that. We're correlating, for example, the ratings on the different things, rating scales of patients with their antidepressant effect, and we're finding there are some things that seem to be more predictive of an antidepressant effect than others, and that's all the kind of stuff that's going to make this better.
And is that a subjective thing we're talking about rather than dosing or infusion length, but I don't know, conversation topic or the like?
Yes, it is. We found that, and I hesitate to say this because then I have patients who come in and they read a study and they think, okay, well, that's the end all and be all. It's this. But we find that the thing that's correlated the strongest is the rating of the positive emotional quality of the experience.
Well, we're so totally going to have you on for the next season, because I think even with this content, we're probably going to need to split it up into 2 episodes, and there's still more I want to ask you. So, David, I just want to say a final time, thank you so much for being a guest on Professionally Psychedelics. You've been wonderful to have, and yeah, just amazing to have you on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun. Thanks, guys.
Please take me above. Take me